All right, we're beginning our Reading the Bible in a Year plan, and it begins in the Gospel of Matthew. So I want to talk briefly just a little bit about these Gospels before we dive into the Gospel of Matthew to kind of prepare you for what you're about to read. So there's four Gospels, but we're gonna talk about the three synoptic Gospels. The three synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John is kind of out there by himself. He's just kind of doing his own gig, his own thing. We're gonna look at these three. We'll talk about John when we get to John. And so, because when you read these three, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you may read some things and go, "Well, I just read that in Matthew. Like, why is this in Mark?" So Mark was written first. And Matthew and Luke took some information and gleaned some parts of Mark and incorporated it into their gospel message. Now, keep in mind, each gospel writer is communicating a different thing about Jesus. They have different audiences and different things they want to share. And look at it this way. If you and I witnessed a key event, a major event in history, we witnessed it. Somebody asked us to give us our take on it. We may each have a different take, and both would be correct. And the more takes you get on this event, right? If you have 1,000 people there and they all can explain this to you, it'll build a bigger, more accurate picture of what happened. And that's kind of the beauty of having these four gospels, is they each have a different viewpoint on Jesus and want to share something different about him that really helps us to fill out who Jesus is. So I think it'd be beautiful we had more gospels to talk about than just these four. That would even give us a clearer picture on Jesus. But these four are very important. So Mark written first, Matthew and Luke take information from Mark, and then they both use their own some own things that they want to share about Jesus. So you'll see some similarities, but some differences. There's a third source that they use. It's called Q. There are no written documents from Q, but we know it's this third source because there are similarities between the Gospels of this information that is not taken from Mark, that it comes from this other source. And we've named it Q. It stands for something, doesn't matter, but that's what it stands for. So you'll see some similarities. So these three synoptic Gospels are very important. So that's just a little info on the Gospels. Now let's talk about Matthew. So let's first talk about who Matthew's audience is, who he's writing to, because this affects what he shares. And this when you read the Bible, knowing who the audience is can help us to understand the passages a little better, understand the context and the setting that is occurring and what is happening. So Matthew's audience is primarily a Jewish audience. Now, this affects a few things. So you'll notice in Matthew, he uses the language of kingdom of heaven a lot in this. He doesn't use kingdom of God. Why, you may ask? Why does he do this? Because for the Jewish people, they never spoke the word God. It was too holy to say. This is why you'll see in the Bible, and especially in Old Testament scriptures, or that we would name it instead of Old Testament, we would call it the Hebrew Bible. That's a much more appropriate name for the Old Testament, and they call it Old Testament according to the Jewish people. It's a much kinder way to reflect that. So the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament, however you understand it, you'll see them use Lord, and they do that because they won't say God. So that is something that tells us about the audience of Matthew. Now, there's a few things kind of going on that we want to get context around to help us to understand what is happening, right? There's a lot of conflict and division going on. And it's between political and religious leaders. There's some that people are considering outsiders and insiders. And I think this is important because when we read Matthew, it can help us to understand maybe our own divisions that we have in our church or our families or our life. And so how can we apply Matthew's words to this to help us to deal with those in our own lives, right? And how can these labels of outsiders and insiders kind of affect us right now? There's also this deep mistrust between the religious and political leaders. There's a lack of ethical leadership going on. And I think that's something for us to consider is what does that look like for us as a church and as a body? What does ethical leadership look like for us? And if we're having these divisions and having these arguments and things are just kind of awry, man, we can take a look at the leaders and go, okay, what's going on here? Is this a leadership issue? Right. So that's something that Matthew will teach us about, and that's something that we can use and apply in today's time. Right. So now also when we talk about these divisions that are going, there's a great gap of power between everyday people and the wealthy people, right? The wealthier, there's a small group of people that hold a lot of power, a lot of institutional power. There's the Romans have put people in place. They hold power, right? They probably like the Romans because of them. Hey, I'm wealthy. I'm powerful. I have a name. I get to rule people. I get to live this comfortable life. And there's some real strife in that. All right. So how does this affect our us in our world and our church when power is condensed down to just a few people? And church leadership, it protects and uplifts those few people and kind of ignores the majority, ignores those on the margins. What you'll see in Jesus in Matthew is somebody who really speaks to marginalized individuals. So how does that affect us, right? So as we read Matthew, we know these divisions are present. How does what Jesus is saying, what Jesus is teaching us in the gospel, how can that affect us in a positive way? How can that move us to appropriate action? Right. So Matthew also has this clash of cultures going on. Right. And we see this today. Right. You may have different ages in your congregation. Social media brings on this clash of culture. I mean, I think about just being in church. I could have somebody who is 2 years old up to 92 years old, right? You're talking about a 90-year age difference. How do we do church that speaks to a 2-year-old and also speaks to a 92-year-old, right? How do we form this place that has to cross generations after generation? Right. This is why it becomes very tricky for us at times when we try to think about what we do as a church. And you may have the little voices, right? The kids, the new to faith, the younger people who don't have that same background or foundation as the older people. They don't have the money to give. But sometimes what we see is those that have the money, they tend to dominate with their voices and money and threats of it. And it really can do harm to the majority of people that may want to see something new. And so we see these cultural issues in church today. So what can we learn from Matthew to help us to deal with that, to build a place for all people? So the 2-year-old to 92-year-old can feel welcomed and can get something from being in this body, being in this house of worship, right? So that's kind of the conflict that's always there. But this is where Scripture can help us to kind of discern that. This is where we can see Jesus in action talking about that. So we're always looking at how do we blend our cultures, right? And so a couple things also going on. Intermarriage is not a thing, right? So depending on what tribe you're a part of, depending on what group you're part of, you would not be allowed to marry inside of that group. Matthew is also trying to incorporate Gentiles into this Jewish kind of congregation. Boy, what does that say for us as we try to welcome people that we would consider outsiders, that other churches would consider outsiders, that religion has considered outsider for a long time, right? Maybe where these laws have been put up to say, well, you can't marry this person, but now we may say you can. This is what Matthew is dealing with. How does this affect us? And what can we learn to build out this community in our own ways, right? Matthew's going to teach us something about this, and it's a very, very powerful gospel for us to use in our churches today. Some other things that Matthew addresses that's kind of unique. It's the only gospel to directly address matters of church authority and discipline. So if we want to know a little more about church authority or how to do some loving discipline, maybe we can get some information from Matthew on that. It also has 5 chapters dealing with the passion of Jesus, right? That's the week leading up to his death. So he deals a lot with the passion, and Jesus also brings children to the front as an example of humility, as an example of how we should, how humility is needed, how we should be humble, and then what is needed for under this reign of God, under this greatness of this reign of God, that we need humility, because Matthew is dealing with people who have some real power, and they're not very humble, and so he is bringing children who are not well thought of in that time, not like today. They're not well thought of. They're there to just carry on the name, go work the fields, help us out. Like, it's not what it is today. So the fact that Jesus pulls these people forward, pulls these kids forward as examples, is a pretty big deal, right? Jesus is also the main interpreter of the law. And this is important for the Jewish people, because the Jewish people really followed the law closely. And so the fact that Jesus is lifted up in Matthew as the main interpreter of the law speaks and gives him authority. And so what Matthew is trying to do is trying to show the Jewish people that Jesus, he's the man, right? He's the guy, right? So, and there's this challenge in this. So this is part of why he lists this up, because Matthew is trying to communicate to the Jewish people that Jesus is the interpreter. Jesus is the Messiah. And we know as time has gone on, the Jewish people have struggled with this idea, right? There are some Jewish people that believe Jesus is the Messiah, but there are some that say, nope, he's nothing more than a prophet. So this is something Matthew early on is trying to communicate to his Jewish followers, right? Now, one thing about the law that we can learn from Jesus, and one thing as you read, just kind of pay attention to this. You'll see moments where Jesus doesn't try to abolish the law, right? There's this fulfillment part. He's come to fulfill what was written, and that's very important. Jesus doesn't abolish the law, because the law is important to the Jewish people. If he would walk in and say, oh, your laws are dumb, screw your laws, it doesn't matter, that would do some real damage to the Jewish people, and they'd probably be like, screw you, man, we don't want to follow you anyways. Like, so one thing Jesus kind of says is, yeah, your laws are important, right? Your laws for a long time have helped to draw you closer into this relationship with God. So we can look at this in our own traditions, right? What are traditions that we do, what traditions that we have that are important to us, that help to draw us closer to God? Jesus says those are important, but they're not so important that they overrule the care of the neighbor, right? So Jesus says, hey, yeah, uphold this law, but I'm going to push you further to say, as you do this law, also go further in it and see how you can care better for your neighbor, how you can develop your love of God even more while doing the law, but going further than what it says. So Jesus is going to push us further and farther in this gospel. All right, you're also going to see some miracles in the Gospel of Matthew. And the miracles, one thing to kind of note on this too, notice that people don't believe after a miracle happens. Miracles are there for faithful people already. People who already have faith and belief in Jesus come to Jesus, and then a miracle happens, right? Because what happens is the Pharisees want to see, hey, why don't you perform this miracle? Then we'll believe. And see, sometimes even today's time, don't we do this? Don't we kind of say, hey, well, why doesn't God just show up? Do this miracle. Why doesn't Jesus show up? Do this thing. Show us who you are, and then we'll believe. Not even at this time. When Jesus is walking the land, does he do this? He doesn't create a miracle so you believe in him. He does miracles for those who already believe. And so I think that's an interesting kind of change in how we look at that. So what can we learn from that? What can we gain from that? How can we communicate with non-believers? How can we communicate with people maybe who have been kind of turned away or have some doubts going, yeah, but I don't see God at work. I don't see, why doesn't he just show up? Well, this may help us to kind of explain that and say, hey, even back then, Jesus wasn't doing miracles to get people to believe. He wasn't going to be used in that way. That wasn't how God was going to show up, right? That kind of eliminates faith. Faith is, I'm going to believe and let's see what happens. And Jesus shows up in those moments, and we can see how Jesus does that for people. So that's a little background on Matthew to help you get started before you begin your reading.